all my important stuff in my coat pocket, and then I put my coat somewhere, and I completely forgot that I had a coat.
Downloaded.
Got my whole pile. We know you called Dawn.
No, haven't heard anything about them.
Don't recall things we did, but
Well, we do have a quorum, so.
can you turn on your mic just so the recording can get it?
Yeah, so we have a quorum, so we're gonna get started. We have Paul Ingles joining us on line this evening. So welcome everyone. In the case of an emergency, you can exit out the back of the room and go either direction to exits on either end of the hall. Does anyone have any agenda changes?
I'd just like to note that the agenda and the memo are in a different order. I just noticed that now, so take whichever order you'd like. Number 5 and 6 are reversed.
Is there, well, when I read the memo, it seems like the second item builds on the first,
Mhm.
is that, so,
I think that's right.
okay, so I'd like to propose that we use the order published in the memo so that the commercial uses, changing the approach to commercial uses to scale and impact is first. Do we need to vote on that? Okay, I'm seeing a bunch of nods, so we'll do that. Okay, open to the public for items not related to the agenda. Does anyone have anything this evening? Go ahead.
Ryan Doyle speaking. I live outside of city center. So very much not on your agenda, very long-term kind of thinking, but I want to echo what I said at the city council meeting last night, which is recently Essex Junction separated from the town of Essex completely as a separate municipality. And if anyone noticed that, you would see that their tax rates went up, but by very different amounts. The town saw an incredibly huge tax increase as a result. And that's because the junction has always subsidized the town. It's been like that a long time. In Vermont, we have a long history of forming villages. Cambridge is lucky enough to still have 2 of theirs, Jeffersonville and Cambridge. But generally speaking, villages where there was an agglomeration of people and a demand for more services, they added this extra layer of government to deliver those. And then as those services were expanded in the later half of the last century, then a lot of villages started to dissolve. The unfortunate situation that we've found ourselves in after a number of years of planning that have been guided from an autocentric perspective is that we have a municipality without any village center or anything like that, but we have extended all of our services to the rural areas where it is not cost effective, or in a sense, we've built out rural areas where it's not cost effective to deliver services. We see this, we're having budget issues and we'll continue to have budget issues for the foreseeable many years, probably as a result. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of false information around this topic out there. It was promulgated by someone last night that adding more houses is then more detrimental, expanding housing, because people will just consume more services and not pay for it. But this isn't the case. The density really matters. The state has been really judicious in forcing municipalities to have more density wherever that they provide services. Makes so much sense. Unfortunately, it was the effort in this town for many years to fight against those kinds of common sense fiscal changes. But we're still seeing that. We have a water sewer service area we're in compliance with the state on, and there's still a push to try to keep that from being built in a dense enough way that it will actually be cost effective. So I want you guys to be really aware of the fiscal implications of the kind of planning we do here, because it's really frustrating for those of us who do live in places that are subsidizing other places that are seemingly nicer, right? Paul subsidizes Mike, Colin subsidizes Helen, I subsidized him. The difference of what we pay for what little we have compared to areas that use many more services per unit of person, land, built area, impervious surface, those are really different. nothing like that is going to be on your agenda recently, but I thought it was really important to note that given some of the pushback to all of the work that you guys have been doing for the last year from the public last night. So thank you for working really diligently on all the changes to come into compliance with S100. And I hope that the really important fiduciary responsibility of the city and your land use planning contributions to it that are behind that are meaningful and they aren't arbitrary. They are very important. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Any other items not related to the agenda? Okay, do we have any announcements from anyone?
Yep. Over the weekend, I attended the dedication of the public art sculpture at JC Park. It was very well attended, and the Chairman Barrett was there and gave a little speech, as did Penny Tompkins, because the chair of the committee wasn't available. And it's really a terrific little installation. And when the light is right, that's the time to see it, because the light shines through these translucent panels, and if you're looking at them edge on, they look like they're lit inside. So go take a look on a sunny day.
Anything from staff?
A few things. It was a busy night at the city council last night, as Chair Barrett could attest. Among them, the city council approved a letter to the Green Mountain Transit Board that is complementary to yours. So it references yours and the foundation of the work that the Planning Commission did about the importance of transit in our plan, and then had some specific routing recommendations that align pretty closely to the mapping we talked about of supporting the continued existence along Shelburne Road, of the Shelburne Road route, of a Williston Road route that exists today, and possibly serving the airport with that. And then a recommending that Green Mountain Transit and those that they share it with explore a reimagining of what was the 11 into being a service that connects Shelburne Road to City Center to the Hill institutions and medical center. And so the council approved that unanimously, and I think felt very positive in their work there out of a challenging situation that Green Mountain Transit is in. So that's one. They held a continued discussion of the zoning amendments that you had advanced to them. They voted to warn a second public hearing for November 4th to include changes very similar to the ones that you had offered up as an option to them, including the ability to have the a area reserved for future use. Staff had a little bit more time to work on it, and so there were a little adjustments in there, but it's essentially the same thing that you had presented. You're going to be receiving that in your next packet for considering whether you're going to make any changes to the report. The vote was 3-2 to advance it to the second public hearing, with the two who were against feeling comfortable that the amendments as drafted could be adopted immediately. So I think that's a strong bout of support from 5 members that they were satisfied. Just 2 were satisfied with the first draft, and 3 were looking forward to the adjustment. There were many complimentary statements to the Planning Commission for all your hard work and to the depth of your analysis of various questions that came up. Councillor Smith made a couple of references to that work. So the council also had their first ever budget listening session last night. So this is a new component of putting together their annual budget. They got some feedback in person and online, and it's being complemented by a online survey that is still open for the next couple of weeks for any community member to provide feedback on what's important to you in community services, and both open responses and also a sort of a ranking of various different municipal areas of service and what's important to help them inform what they should be putting into the upcoming budget. continuing along, we are planning a celebratory event for the actual unveiling of the new road to Tilio Drive right next to us that you had the great meeting on earlier this fall or this summer. So we're working with the school principal to do a really neat event right here. That is just been scheduled today for October 29th at 2 p.m. Where the kids are going to get to celebrate that. So I will.
Did you name up on it already?
No, that's going to be the unveiling of it. Yeah. So I'll send you all an invitation. You'd be more than welcome to attend. So that's really exciting. What else? We heard from the Supreme Court yesterday, the federal Supreme Court, on the subject of an appeal from 835 Heinsberg Road. The Supreme Court declined to take up the matter. So the U.S. District Court of Appeals decision stands. So there are still other litigation related to this property, but the Supreme Court did not. Yes, what did I say? Yes, sorry, Circuit Court of Appeals declined to take it up. So that is completed in that action. What else did I miss?
Change the nature of the takings law, right?
Define
Yes.
the contours of takings, is how I would
Right.
probably put it.
And so what the lower court had ruled was that the application as presented was not ripe. So they did not rule on the subject of takings. They ruled that the applicant has to submit essentially a plan in order to test the question of whether there is takings or not. But is that a brief enough one sentence of it? And I think that's it. Okay. Onwards to
Great.
the next items.
Okay. Well, thanks all for working on the GMT letter last meeting. I had a work commitment and missed it, but you did it. And I was very excited to see in the minutes that had gone forward. So I guess we can move on to the commercial uses. This is something we've dabbled around in for many years now, and it's always been little one-off. So can we combine these things, or in form-based code, can we, kind of try to eliminate uses as much as possible? So I'm pretty excited about this discussion. I think it's timely. So, do you want
Sure.
to take it away?
Yeah, so as Jessica said, this has happened in bits and pieces as it's come up over the years for various reasons and in different districts and all of that. What we're looking for now is actually to reorient the approach that the city takes to commercial uses. Over time, it's become more clear that someone who makes watches and someone who's a catering business may have very similar impacts on their surroundings, on the neighborhood, on traffic, on whatever else it is. But they'd be regulated as two different uses. And in some places, they'd be allowed in a district and not allowed in another district, even when they're extremely functionally similar. So this task is how we're framing, taking a holistic look at the use table and seeing what things duplicate each other pretty fully. And then also what things are so similar in scale and in impact that they could be considered one thing. This is not necessarily what we're proposing, but hypothetically, you could have something like light commercial is under a certain size and doesn't produce excess noise or smoke or something, but we don't actually care what you're doing in your commercial structure. But then heavy commercial or something similar would be the opposite, over that size with some impacts or vice versa. So what we're hoping to get out of this meeting is, number one, an endorsement from the commission of that kind of approach that we can use to develop concepts that we can bring back to you. And then get a little bit into the details, not all the way into the details, but a little bit into the details about what impacts do you think are important? What, is it smoke? Is it noise? Is it traffic? Is it light? Is it 24-hour operation? Is it trucking? You know, there's a good number, there's a lot of different impacts that a commercial space could have on its surrounding neighborhood or commercial area. And then is there a scale of commercial use that it actually doesn't matter what objectively their impacts are, but it is of a certain scale? Like maybe it's the cleanest, quietest, most unobtrusive business in the world, but they have 500 employees or something like that. Like, is there a scale where your actual impacts start to matter less, and it's just the size of the building and the size of the use that we want to examine? And that can be both, this is, as Jessica said, this is related a bit to other questions, but this also relates to built environment. Like even if a business has very little actual impact, maybe we want the scale of the building that they'd need to be in certain areas of the city. So it's, you know, understanding it would be less walkable if the building is 100,000 square feet, things like that. So we wanted to frame out some of those questions. And then the second question that's related to this is, can we also use this opportunity to discuss, Donna had brought this up during the previous LDR amendment session, what the medium scale neighborhood should allow or should not allow, and relatedly what C2, which is very similar in certain ways, but allows some of this light manufacturing that we're talking about redefining. Can we look at those districts in conjunction with this new approach to commercial spaces? And then the last question, and then I'll let you all start getting into it a little bit, is what we're proposing for transparency purposes is the Planning Commission does a lot of things, and we work on a lot of projects fairly simultaneously. And so for members of the public, it may seem difficult to understand, you know, what is the actual scope of the project that the Planning Commission is working on? Like, how did it expand into this thing, or how does it touch that thing? Or, you know, 6 months after they started doing a different thing. So we're proposing having a more established project scope document, more like you would in like private consulting, or similar, where it says, here's our project, here are the questions we're trying to ask, here's the purpose, like this is what we're trying to achieve, so that anyone from the public can say like, oh, when I see this project come up on the agenda, I know that the core of that project is this scope document. So that's just something that we were floating as an idea for the commission to be more transparent, especially for members of the public who can kind of, maybe they're available for one meeting, but they're not available for another meeting, you know, until 6 months later. They can keep track of things a little bit better. So those are the three big questions. I don't know where you'd like to start.
Just in terms of the use of the word transparency, I was never under the impression that the work of the Planning Commission was not transparent. So to me, that's a loaded word.
Okay.
And I think what I'm gathering from those questions is and I think from our conversations, both at the council level and the commission level, what we're really interested in is having the public understand what we're discussing, the reasons we're discussing it, and what our conclusions are, which to me is, since we only meet in public and it's taped, it can't be anything but transparent, our conversations. So, you know, I think just using that word suggests that there's potentially in the past, there's some nefarious activity going on with deals made under the table or conversations that were not public. And I've never thought of the commission as ever going down that road.
In no way is that what is meant by transparency when I say this. Transparency, from my perspective and the way I'm using it, is improving the accessibility of information from the planning
Right.
commission to the public, because there is a barrier for people who are not active in local government or the legal world or government at all to understand how the process works. Like, how does a topic change from one meeting to the next? Who suggests what, like some of these things. So it's not that anything has ever been shielded. It's more that I think transparency can always be improved as you're moving forward to clear and concise public communication.
I think a
Well,
better
thank-
word would be what you just used, which is that it's accessible
Sure.
rather than transparent, accessibility and rather than transparency.
So I guess I have a question about the project scope. I'm in no way opposed to it, but I guess I wonder, would this become like our new norm when we take up a new topic to have like first think about what's our goals, what are we trying to accomplish, and like put bounds on it? And then like what's the threshold for some small topic where
Mhm.
you're really just kind of doing one small topic and
Yeah.
hoping to get through it in 1 or 2 meetings? I guess I wanted to just think about like I know our project scope isn't its own agenda item, but like just kind of understanding like, because I think it is a good idea to be able to say, this is the topic we're working on and why. And, we're pretty bad with scope creep. Like we're always trying to add some other thing or going off on a tangent, something. I mean, so I think it could even help us in our meetings to be like, this is what we agreed we were going to talk about. This is the part of the city or the chapter or, however we're going to define our scope. But
Yeah, I think
Like,
I
yeah.
think the core of this is that our city manager, Jesse Baker, has been really working in the last few years to make sure that city government and our volunteer boards and committees are oriented to sort of row in the same direction. And that's the intention of the policy priorities and strategies that come from city council, and then everybody having work plans and everything being oriented to the city plan and the goals and actions in the city plan. So part of this, which I think is what you're talking to a little bit, is having a project scope that defines what are the goals and actions we're working towards that are in the city plan. Are there specific things on the work plan that are being accomplished? Like, for example, this one would actually, as I noted, cover 3 different ones that are on the work plan in one kind of holistic process. So really being clear about what things are included and how they're connected. And then the other thing is, because the city plan has the key principles, taking a minute in the beginning of working on a new topic to really sort of refresh on the key principles, make sure that the project is moving in a direction that is consistent with those key principles, and setting that all at the beginning so the project is successful and well connected to the other goals of the city.
Two other things just quickly to add to it. One, adding to what our city manager's been working on, building the structures and systems of a larger community that we are. And so as you invite other committees to provide feedback, they know the scope of the project, and they're not having to sort of guess or rely on, committee member X calls Commissioner Y to understand it, that there's something written to it. And sort of connected to that, and specifically responsive to some of your conversations in the last year where you asked us, how do we do the plain language version of the LDRs? How do you make
Yeah.
this accessible to people to know what are these really dense conversations going on? When there's an umbrella to it, it means it's a lot easier for us to, for example, have a web page that says, this is the project. And when somebody attends a meeting and they're trying to sort of insert themselves into a conversation, that they know what's being talked about big picture while you guys work through various different aspects of it. So we think it's really a community access item too, as alongside being keeping us all on task for the work that you want to accomplish.
But I
Are you
think there's
thinking-
definitely space for those one meeting items that you wouldn't need to approve a project scope and then and then the next meeting is when you actually deal with it. I think there's some ability to remain nimble in this, but especially if it's a thing that's listed in the work plan, sort of called out specifically, And especially if you're trying to combine a few things in the work plan, really showing that connection, I think would be helpful. But then, you know, one-off things about a street name or something come up, you don't need a project scope for that.
Yeah, okay, I love that. So there's two things I really like about this. One is that I think we've often had a member of the public come and be kind of confused about where we are and what the goal was and why we're talking about whatever it is. Do you think we'd have the ability that in our agenda memos that you would always be able to kind of provide that link back to the project scope?
Yep,
Because
absolutely.
then it's maybe not as much background information, but you'd be able to have somebody easily find that.
Yep.
That seems like a really nice use. And then I think so far it's just been like up to us to know what the goals and objectives and the comp plan or the city plan were and be thinking about them the whole time. And then at the very, very end, we get this report, the legal report that goes along with our changes, where then all of a sudden staff, because
Mhm.
we're not doing it, goes back into the city plan and pulls those out and
Mhm.
matches them up with the stuff we did. But we weren't like arranging all those in a way for everybody to like look at ahead of
We
time.
weren't even conscious of that.
No, and that's why I said like we're all supposed to be doing that in our own heads and looking back, but I think that that's hard. So it'll be nice to, I like that we'll have the comp plan or city plan connection in the beginning. And then I guess I have another question is, so we have two agenda items
Yep.
and they have quite a bit of overlap.
Yeah.
And they both are talking about project scopes. Are you thinking that items 5 and 6 would kind of have one scope? Because it's kind of a there's
th-
some related.
I think
They're
they actually
quite-
have two.
Okay.
They definitely impact each other and they do overlap, and some of the decisions in one would influence the other. But the first one is citywide in part of it and related to the MSN and the C2 and other parts of it, where the second one is much more focused on the mixed IC, the IO, sort of the more industrial areas of the city. So they geographically are a bit separated. So it made sense, in my mind at least, to have, there's definitely overlap of that redefining of uses, but making sure that we're focusing on the two different sort of scales of area as two different scopes. But if the commission disagrees, then we can take that in another direction.
For example, the first one here is housing is already allowed in all those districts.
Right.
The second one of supporting use in commercial districts does not allow housing as a category. That's a very different conversation about what is the nature of commercial and industrial in the first one. And so you could have complete agreement and complete decisions about what types, like how you consolidate uses and still have a very different conversation about whether it's appropriate to have residential or what level of scale of supporting uses, other supporting uses you want in a geographic area.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for kind of the context. Yes, I guess maybe to jump into sort of my thoughts on some of the questions that have been posed. I start off, I think factors. I mean, I think we've already alluded to this, but I do think noise is going to be a very big one, no matter what we do.
The what is?
Noise in terms of
Oh,
impact
noise,
on impact,
okay.
because you like, I'm just saying, like, what do people tend to complain of? Like, oh, there's this business
I
moving.
just didn't hear it.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Great irony in there. But yeah, I guess I feel that I'm just trying to think like why would someone object to a business moving in close to them?
Yeah.
And I think noise is going to be a big one. And that's both in terms of what the business itself generates, but also how it's serviced. And I think he's mentioned like deliveries, for example, I mean, and at least to bring a personal experience into it, I live right next to a Walgreens that regularly gets deliveries at 6 a.m. That's a little annoying. It's not a violation of the noise ordinance. It's just kind of annoying, So I think it's sort of how both what noises these things generate and also how these uses might get serviced. And I mean, I guess more broadly, like, I guess a framework I think about is like, what is the kind of sensory experience of this business? Like, is smell relevant? Or are there any businesses that potentially could be emitting a noxious smell that isn't already covered by other regulations for on state level or something? I guess I guess I mainly jump on noise. So I could see that as being the kind of sensory impact that's probably the most relevant, but there may be other sensory impacts, I guess is how I'm trying to say. And yeah.
I had more or less the same, but more succinct. Noise, traffic, parking, emissions, and air quality were the things that I think would have impacts that people would be concerned about. It's congestion, or maybe instead of parking, I might say congestion, traffic congestion, but traffic covers it. And then your other question is, are there types of uses and services that are definitionally high impact or low impact, regardless of scale? Well, low impact things like restaurants. Why do we need two kinds of restaurants? Or should we replace restaurants and short order places as a food service to cover everything? Most retail, I think, including furniture and wine, excluding big box stores, how do we draft a definition that's allows some kind of retailing, but not these huge things, maybe it's building size?
Yep, and that's what we're talking about when we say scale, is some of these things are
And then,
incongruous.
high impact logistics organizations and big box stores like Lowe's and Home Depot and Best Buy, sort of the same thing as I mentioned above. It would be really nice to combine medium scale with C2, if we could, by editing and condensing the uses in the table that you'll show us later on. So there's when I sit back and look at and imagine the city, I see the main thoroughfares: Shelburne Road, Williston, Patchen Road, Heinsberg Road, Dorset, north of Kennedy. I think they should all be zoned to allow mixed use, both commercial and then maybe light industrial, which we'll have a problem defining, because on logic is light industrial, but it's huge.
Right, right. So at some point, when we're defining by what somebody makes, it doesn't make sense anymore. So there's a scale at which you're doing something that you're making. It's not what OnLogic does, but if they were making millions of watches in a year, they would be considered light manufacturing because they're making watches, but they might be 200,000 square feet of floor area.
And as an example that we often see is a small producer of food to, let's say to help sell to Healthy Living and a few other stores is light industrial. So it could be, if they're not operating it out of their home,
it's food service.
It could be, but it is currently defined as light industrial. So it could be half the size of this stage. And if it's a commercial kitchen, they are producing a thing including food. So it's
Light manufacturing.
Like
It's light
Rhino Foods
manufacturing.
used to be, you mean, down there?
but even smaller. Go
Oh,
down
yeah.
to making,
Salsa.
cookies.
Yeah.
It
If you define the use so closely, it would be a problem.
which is what it is today. So as for instance,
So it's
we don't,
defined too closely today, is that what you're saying?
Yes,
Okay,
it's defined too closely / it is not, it is separated by the use category, not the scale of the impact of the use.
it's
So
often
you
by
could make-
product.
Right. I could be a solo manufacturer of cookies, or it could be Nabisco. Both make cookies. Both are light industrial. Both have very different implications
Mhm.
of what they do in different parts of our community.
Mhm.
The use is the same, but the scale and therefore the impact it could be very, very different.
Yeah.
So is volume an important definition, or is scale more appropriate?
I definitely like the idea of using building size just because like guessing about how much volume something might be created, how much traffic something generate, that could easily vary widely based on when it was built versus like 10 years, 20 years down the line. So I guess in an abstract, it'd be nice to like, I guess, be focusing more was the actual volume, but I think in practice, that's going to be, I worried that's going to be a little too tricky to accurately quantify because there's just so many uncertain variables. And I guess I personally like the idea of using like building size as a kind of proxy for volume. It's definitely not perfect, but I don't think we're ever gonna have a perfect way of
Yeah.
going
Well,
about
maybe
There,
this.
there are also situations where like a business goes into or builds a building that is actually too big for them right now because they're intending to grow over the next 5 years. So the visual impact of the business is the same because the scale of the building is the
Right.
same in year 0 or in year 5, but maybe the volume of product they're producing quadruples, or maybe they have no product. Maybe they build
Like dealer.com.
Dealer.com.
Which had a lot of employees, but they weren't like shipping out boxes
Right.
of stuff. So big building, lots of employees, lots of traffic,
Sure.
but
I think
no.
it would be tricky, though, to have the scale of the building, if it's built for future growth,
Mhm.
the impact of that potentially is more employees, which is more traffic, more, a greater number of widgets that you're making, that need to get shipped out. So more trucks or that kind of, impact. I just think it would be a little tricky when someone comes in and says, well, I want to build
Mhm.
twice what I need because I know I'm going to grow.
Yeah.
Well, if they don't grow, then I guess that's their problem. But
Yeah.
if they do, or if they don't grow quite as much, how do you sort of determine the real impact?
Yeah, and these are
And
the
not
questions
be
that we're going to
over-
work through in the coming meetings. We're just,
Yeah,
this,
no,
it's
I
great
think
to
that
hear
would be a
these
challenge.
brainstorming questions.
You-
Yeah.
You used an example of printing, let's take
Yeah.
Staples. Staples sells stuff
Hmm.
and makes copies for people.
Right.
Prints copies. So, and it's of a certain size, and then a light manufacturing would be a printing press
Right.
with binding
Right.
facility, but it could be a press that's a quarter of the size of Staples.
Right.
With like 2 employees.
Hmm.
Right, yeah.
Very.
Yeah, it's sort of a challenge.
Well,
Yeah.
One other thought I was just having is, I don't know, this is definitely we not make it too complicated, but would it be at all appropriate to people think like if we're maybe talking about like potentially, if we're looking at maybe square footage, would it maybe make sense to have different cutoffs for different uses? Cause like I could sort of see like some types of businesses like, I don't know, like an office facility that's 10,000 square feet versus say a restaurant that's 10,000 square feet might have differing traffic impacts. And I think it's definitely, I totally believe that it could get really hairy and really aggressive really quickly, but like at the very least, maybe having more than one cutoff for like what is low scale and what's high scale based on a broad definition of use, something that might be worth considering, but I don't know if our people agree or if they think that's
Yeah. And
too complex.
just something to know is that we do regulate traffic otherwise as
Mhm.
well. So it's, you may be allowed to be a use in a certain district, but, the cost of the certain number of traffic units, there's other ways that those things get regulated in our regulations and with the new transportation demand management system. So having to install bike racks or extra bike racks and covered things and all that kind of stuff that was in front of the planning commission last couple months. So some of these things are still otherwise regulated. So yes, I agree that there's probably a different scale for, a very large restaurant is going to be a different thing than a very large warehouse. but there are some cross-cutting standards like traffic, lighting, performance standards. There's a handful of things that apply across the board. So
Would-
we'll keep talking about that.
On that note, then would it make sense that when we're going about this, like to mention, to specifically call out, to also to make it very clear to, anyone who's reading this, like, hey, we're not addressing this because this is addressed elsewhere, like kind of be explicit about that, like as I could see someone like
Be helpful.
reading through our changes, like, well, why aren't you addressing this? But we can just like have to say like, hey, we've already got this regulation here that addresses, like, think about what the concerns are and mention when the concerns are already addressed elsewhere. Could be, I think, could
Right.
potentially
Well,
be a
and I
way.
think that can also be feedback to yourselves. So for example, using traffic as
Mhm.
as one example of this, we have, pretty substantial resources out there that use national studies to identify the average number of trips that any particular use has based on the size of that use, square footage of the use.
Mhm.
And so as you sort of assess and determine, well, in this setting of the city, an industrial use, how much impact is appropriate, that can feed back on itself too. And we can say, well, a 50,000 square foot industrial building typically has
Mhm.
this number of trips. Is that too much impact for you? That kind of thing. And this is not just one other quick note. This is not a totally new conversation for you all. Those who've been on the commission for a little while, you did some work in this specifically in the retail category a few years ago. You consolidated grocery store, pharmacy, retail into a singular category. And then in different parts of the city, you identified the maximum square footage of any individual tenant of that category, so that on Shelburne Road, it's unlimited, but in some of the more transitional neighborhood areas, it is smaller, so that the use is still permissible, but the difference between
Like around Heinsberg Road and Kennedy Drive, that intersection, there
Right.
were limits.
right, and even more so at like South Village. So you could have a little tiny corner store
Mhm.
is the same use as Market 32, but it's not the same scale. So
The two examples that I referred to a moment ago, Staples, well, it's retail.
Mhm.
A small printing press is light industrial.
Mhm.
But they should be allowed in the same place, in the same zone.
one of the
Hel-
games,
yeah.
Michael, that we, I'm
Mm.
sorry, go ahead.
No, no,
Looking at
answer
mixed
it.
use.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
No, no.
yeah, Paul and then
One of our interview questions that we often do with new staff people is we do a roundtable conversation about inventing some use that nobody's ever heard of and how do we categorize it? And
Mm.
how would we have a dialogue in our staff about it? So we come up with something that to our knowledge has not yet existed. And then invariably within the next 6 months, we actually get an application for the thing. So it's just a reminder that, we haven't thought of all the things yet. And so how do we be nimble? How do we learn from the lessons of the form-based code to enable creativity while protecting the things that actually matter to the community?
Well, that kind of doesn't really address, but it's connected to my question. And part of this is just, I don't know what we actually have on the books, but I'm thinking of the potential of repurposing some potentially really big buildings that are in existence now, but they're not being used. And so in the future, they could be used for very different things. And I don't know, so if it's just the size of the building, that won't have as much relevance to, well, it used to be a car dealership or something, and now it's no longer a car dealership, but there are 5 different smaller industries or businesses that want to go in. And do we have a way of, through our regulations, managing that? Or once it's built, it's,
So something that Paul and I internally have talked about, and sort of floated before, is could we have a use that is an adaptive reuse? So it's,
yeah.
the building scale is already there and maybe you're putting something in, you're cutting it up in a different way, or you're
Uh-huh.
using it in a different way. Is that something to explore as a different use category or a different scale category if we sort of explore these different options. Where someone wouldn't, you buy a building that's 11,000 square feet and there's a cutoff at 10,000 square feet and you go, oh man, I'm a deli, but I'm suddenly shoved into this other category because I happened to buy a building that needed to be repurposed. We shouldn't be penalizing that.
Right.
So maybe that's something that can be involved in this conversation in the
Okay.
scope of this project.
Because we don't have that right
We
now.
don't have a great tool for that. And there's
Okay.
a couple different versions of that, of both, as Kelsey was talking about, of, how could you cut up an existing building? Another version of an adaptive reuse tool is to say, sometimes a building that is totally out of scale exists. And maybe in the instance of a building that is totally out of scale and happens to exist, it's allowed to do different things than what's around it. So on, what is it? South Willard Street in Burlington, there's the old school.
Oh, yeah.
That's
yeah.
a professional office, and
That's
it's in
right,
the middle
yeah.
of something that is, everything else is a totally different scale around it. But that building can be all sorts of things uniquely to that building because the building's been around for 100 years.
Okay.
Or, you could say the Mill Market building along Dorset Street, sort of in that category. It's a 7,000 square foot building, a portion of which is used for the Mill Market, but we're not going to have another building necessarily of that scale there.
Uh-huh.
How could that be, physical building allowed to be used in creative ways that maybe others wouldn't be able to? So
Yeah, it's a more express
you-
way to grandfather grandfather the building that wouldn't require you to keep the use forever. You could change the use of the building because the building's already there.
So
So what
don't-
about the Sears Auto Building? How did that work? Those uses were all allowed?
yes.
Yeah.
And actually specifically, it's the form-based code. So in the form-based code, it's a list of a handful of prohibited uses in the form-based code.
Okay.
So all the uses that went in there were not prohibited.
Okay.
To add on, I definitely like this idea of some form provision for like adaptive reuse. To add to as well, I remember just last month, we had some people who were concerned that there was that pet facility out on Heinsberg
Mhm.
Road, that they're concerned about someone buying it in the future wouldn't be able to do X, Y, and Z with it. I do think that an adaptive use could be helpful for kind of assuring current business owners too, that their building could be reused in some way. I do wonder if that's not unlimited, of course, but that could be something that could be
It's important.
selling point, I guess,
Yeah, there's-
for these regulations.
There's definitely a discussion point that we can include in the scope of this project,
Yeah.
for sure.
And I think, it's actually come up a bunch of times. There was that medical building, used to be a welding shop on Williston Road.
Mhm.
And then it came up in the Tesla discussion,
Sure.
grocery store going to a car dealership, and how would so we actually talked about the idea of, because it's an existing building, should there be some kind of something in our rules so that someone wouldn't have to tear down a building to
Right.
a different one? So we didn't do it at that time,
Yep.
but
Are there
Seems like it'd
other
be good.
sort of factors or considerations that came to anyone's mind about an impact?
I was just thinking, I was looking at the medium scale neighborhood and I was thinking about it's two scenarios. One where we're primarily commercial and we're trying to bring residential there.
Mhm.
And the other where we're primary residential and trying to bring commercial there.
Mhm.
And how those two scenarios might play out. And, how do we create, a level playing field? So, the folks who, like Wilson Road, we'd love to get more residential on Wilson Road. It's primarily commercial right now. So is that threshold going to be lower as terms of what, would be allowed? Versus, and I was trying to think of,
Yep.
of a medium scale neighborhood, primarily residential area that has a little commercial, and we would want to bring more commercial there.
Yeah, I'm not,
Gonna have the Bourne buildings that are gonna go up at the corner of Swift and Shelburne. That's gonna be mixed, commercial and residential.
Mhm.
But that's a primarily commercial area.
Yes. but
Or we're
it's gonna
adding
be-
residential.
we're
I'm thinking,
adding-
the other
You're
scenario
doing
too.
the
Yeah,
flip
yeah.
side. It's
Kennedy Road,
mostly
residential.
residential and.
No.
That's MSN, isn't it? Yeah.
What's that?
Kennedy Drive.
Kennedy Drive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about these
Yeah.
two different scenarios
Yeah.
and we're trying to accomplish the same goal, but we're kind of coming at it from different sides.
Yeah, and something to
Consider
be
both.
considered in this is we just did the limited neighborhood commercial as a use, the very small sort of
Yep.
corner store scale thing, is, and that was primarily geared towards the LSN.
Yeah. Lower
It would
scale.
also be allowed in the MSN, but it was primarily of the scale of the LSN. Like, is there a version of that that is, you know, neighborhood serving size that would be maybe a little bit bigger or a little, or there could be 2 or 3 tenants in the building or whatever it is, in the Kennedy Drive or the Timberlane, area. You know, things.
On the corner, there's a little corner store that
Mhm.
serves that industrial area.
One of the things that, you know, Monica, one of our previous commissioners, had really talked about a lot was, you know, for the people who do now and will in the future live along our traveled corridors, you know, our higher density areas, like, how do we make sure that those people don't wind up in a situation where all the loud, noisy, smelly things are all there? Like, you know, like if we're combining uses and we're
Mhm.
thinking about these ones that are high impact, how do we keep those high impact separate from like mixed use?
Yep.
And, you know, so maybe the ones that are high impact don't go into those mixed use areas. So I think we still want to like think through like
Mhm,
what
mhm.
makes sense in our corridors. You know, because we have people living there too.
Yeah.
Like which uses really should be maybe further from
And I think
homes.
the flip side of that conversation is actually the next agenda item is where do we have commercial uses already that are a certain level of impact or industry or noise or trucking or whatever it is, where, you know, we don't want to allow housing? Do we want to have places that are isolated for not any kind of housing versus are there places that are, you can bring in some housing because the, you know, industrial uses that are allowed there are not allowed to be high impact. You know, that's where, as I said, these two questions definitely overlap, both with what Duncan was saying and what you were saying, Jessica. So I think that's definitely something to consider.
I would toss out one third leg of that same stool, which is in priority areas, and define what you mean, you know, priorities up for definition, but whether it's where people live or whether we have services like transit, a factor may be to what extent is it employment intensive versus not employment intensive. So for example, like, not to pick on self-storage, but self-storage could be very quiet, but having it where the city is investing hundreds of $1,000s a year in transit, you know, may or may not be the right fit there.
That's right.
You know, or, you know, what's
The
the
close.
relationship of where you're all making your major investments in infrastructure to where you want to have the things that people need as services like medical offices, or on the flip side of it, where some land uses need a lot of space but don't necessarily provide a ton of jobs or a lot of foot traffic. Maybe those ones you would want to categorize differently as their own sort of grouping, and we haven't quite gotten as to what that would look like, but you know, use that as a metric also, because your investments in, say, transit are major investments every year.
I guess one of the keys is to avoid developing sort of, I guess, what is sometimes referred to as spot zoning. Like we want this little thing here, so we'll zone it one little area on one street
Yep.
for this kind of industry or business, when it could very well go in other places as well if you're kind of even-handed or looking at the whole. So I think that's a challenge as well. But I certainly appreciate thinking about where the city's making investments, where we want people to live, and the kinds of, you know, mixed use and businesses that we would want to zone to incentivize that kind of development or redevelopment, which is a little trickier, I suppose, than
Well, you had asked some questions about or asked whether space should be reserved.
That's the next item. Are you ready? It is 7:55.
Oh, well, I guess before we go into that, how about, are there other thoughts about the project scope, or do we think generally the things we talked about would kind of combine into that? I have at
Just-
least some notes on all of
Yeah.
these items.
If we project on the project scope, development of the project scope, you can be sure that that we might set the expectations of the end result, but you can be sure that's going to change. So in the course of doing this work, how will we allow that flexibility?
So I guess the intention is that you would be writing, that we would be writing the purpose, how the purpose of this project is connected to the city plan goals and actions. And then what are sort of the desired end products? And that would be that wouldn't be necessarily like zone Williston Road to allow for whatever, because that's presupposing the answer. It would be, you know, re-examination of the table of uses, or something that it's like, we're dealing with this specific part of the LDRs, or we're dealing with LDRs at all. There might be other projects where we're not dealing with LDRs at all. And setting the sort of the parameters of like, what are the questions we're asking? Why are we asking them? How does those questions advance city goals, and what are we expecting at the end? So where the conversation goes in the middle and what the end conclusions are, that remains open.
Okay, that's fine.
My God, we would be focused. We wouldn't go down rabbit holes.
Never.
Sign me up. I like it.
Thank you.
Okay, here, where is our
Yeah.
timing? Did I hear we're actually on track? Oh, we're 5 minutes behind now. Look at that. Okay.
Oh, no.
I think we're good though. So I think as Michael said, we're gonna talk about reserved areas.
Well,
So we're now on to item number 6, just as a, just to be clear, the supporting uses in commercial areas.
well, you had to ask the question, and my notes say, yes, we do need to broaden this to include housing. I put workforce housing. And then, of course, if we're going to do that, we have to consider the impact of Act 47. Maybe we have to think about maximum density if there's housing in a commercial industrial area. Maybe we have to designate or be able to designate specific areas reserved for housing and other specific areas reserved for industrial or commercial activity or buildings.
Duncan?
We eliminated housing in one of these districts prior to this.
You, in the draft amendments in front of council right now, housing is not allowed, is proposed to be not allowed in the industrial open space district, because previously it was essentially an industrial open space district, and housing was allowed at a scale of 1 home per 3 acres, which meant that it was never being built. All of a sudden with Act 47, that completely flipped to at least 5 units an acre, which changed the balance of intent. And so temporarily the commission removed that
Okay.
so that it could actually study the subject, because it was technically a residential district, but not functionally and not by any purpose, other than to maybe allow a handful of 3-acre lots to not be nonconformities, which was probably what was written 25 or 50 years ago.
So I guess, question, so so it sounds like workforce housing was one of the reasons that's motivating this discussion, is my understanding.
Yeah, so what happened was a large business called OnLogic, who's located in Tech Park, built a new facility and then came in and said, hey, can we build something where we could temporarily house new workers, but also potentially, you know, visitors from our other sites, clients and suppliers, things like that. You know, the structure of something along the lines of an extended stay hotel appearance, and the anticipation that people don't live there for 6 years, they live there for 6 months if they live there, you know, for any amount of time. And that sparked, the planning commission deferred that conversation because we recognize that it's a much broader conversation than just allowing one business to do one thing on their property. It would potentially allow someone else to use a property for purely an extended stay hotel, not related to a business, just there, or someone just building apartments in the middle of Tech Park. And is that something we want or don't want? So that's how the question went from this big to this big. And that's what we're trying to scope now is, do you want the question to remain this big, or the more holistic approach is what we're recommending?
A question I'll definitely have for us we're going about this is, if we're saying that it is okay for people to be living here, like even if it's a couple months, that is still like people are living there.
Correct.
I guess I'd want to be very clear if we are then restricting general housing, if we choose to do that, to be very concrete in our justification, like if it's okay to have these housing, why can't we just build apartment blocks here?
Right.
I'm not trying to presuppose it, but I think it's more of a question of like, that's
exactly the question.
Yeah.
And it's, what we've outlined in these questions is are there areas that should allow that kind of accessory temporary housing versus principal use extended stay hotel or housing, or principal use full housing? Are our current districts reflecting where we actually want certain things and not other things? Currently, we have the IO district that is effectively south of the interstate, directly across the interstate from the mixed IC district, that in a lot of ways look very similar, close to the interstate, but then it also includes all the way up and through Williston Road, where there's a lot of smaller businesses and smaller commercial spaces. So it's, how do we look at housing holistically in this whole sort of historically commercial area? And what do we allow where? And as you said, where do we justify allowing housing? And is there really a functional difference between housing and temporary housing?
Right, or accommodations in housing, I guess is
Yeah.
what I wanted to
Yep.
suggest is an interesting sort of, you know, what OnLogic presented was really for their employees, which would mean that it is, you know, purpose-built to support the businesses there directly. That brings its own challenging questions of, let's say OnLogic outgrows that facility and they move somewhere else. The next owner of the building may or may not want to do something like that. On the flip side, if what you choose to allow is housing, would you be comfortable, like straight up housing, would you be comfortable in a market that has for the last 20 years really tilted towards the residential, your commercial industrial areas being built as residential and not reserving space for businesses, because that could be an effect. So I think those are some of the questions that we recommend. One I wanted to draw your specific attention to, because staff's been thinking about this a lot, is the third open bullet there. Reserving space for industrial only uses. Is that an important question? So a lot of our districts, commercial, industrial open space, have a broad categories of employment, I'll call it. That could be an office, or it could be a light manufacturer. Offices, conceptually, per the last conversation we just had 15 minutes ago, could be placed anywhere in many settings. They could be in downtowns, they could be along Shelburne Road. Certain uses really can't be near housing. You know, ones that have a lot of trucks and things like that. Should part of this analysis and this consideration be, should a portion of the areas that we think of as commercial and industrial actually have their allowed uses shrink to those that really cannot be near housing, i.e. like maybe something like offices no longer is allowed in that area unless it's an office sort of to support a manufacturer, knowing that, you know, the asset of being in the center of Chittenden County is in and of itself a very limited asset. And so if we are hoping to attract the next OnLogic, not just we at South Burlington, but we Chittenden County, frankly, do we need to make sure that it's being held for that space and not for a also good employer, but something that could be located in lots of different places?
Mhm.
That's a really hard conversation because, you know, we all want to support employment and jobs, but should looking at that be part of this analysis?
Yeah, but we also all want housing. So reserving, I think you have to reserve.
Well, when I
for
say,
both.
well, yes, I was trying to distinguish, I was setting aside the housing conversation for a minute and having a conversation intra-employment.
Yeah, well, I
And
mentioned
so
logistics. So for instance, the new FedEx facility, you don't want housing around there because there are trucks going in and out there 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So you wouldn't want a residence nearby. But there are other areas in Tech Park or Tilly Drive area or Meadowlands, which are close to Heinsberg Road, for example. There's open space. You know, I did a drive around some months ago to look at what space might be available for housing in these 3 or 4 zones, industrial zones. And there is plenty, but needs to be contained.
Paul Engels, did you, so you've, let me know if you're trying to say something. I know you did, put your camera on there for a second.
No, I have, I don't know, I've done something that's caused the picture to be in.
Okay,
poor-
no problem. I just wanted to make sure we weren't missing you.
Okay.
No, thanks.
Dunk-
I'll let you know.
Good, thanks, Paul. Okay, Duncan and then Colin.
So
So the
are,
question-
are you proposing, I'm looking at the, sorry, I gotta go back and look at the IO and the mixed industrial commercial. Are you proposing that we reconfigure the boundaries there or blend those?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's, we put on the future land use map kind of a purplish area and
Mhm.
then left other things as I think it was blue. Can you show, I think it's,
Yeah,
Gray.
no,
anyway,
Yeah.
the potential for having some of the areas remain more industrial focused and commercial focused while having other things either change in commercial scale or allow housing or both, I think it's a very appropriate conversation to have. Because if, as Michael said, if you do kind of a drive around, the IO district, like Meadowlands area, looks more similar to Tech Park than Tech Park looks to the Williston Road corridor
Mhm.
in that area. So yes, I think that conversation is definitely open for realigning districts as part of this conversation.
There could also be a division within the blue that we've talked about of the scale of, say, Meadowlands or of Gregory Drive even is very different than the scale of what's in the Ethan Allen Industrial Park
Mhm.
behind the airport. You know, one is a lot of very small businesses,
Mhm.
another is FedEx scale. And so is there stemming from your last conversation, is there a distinction in the function of those areas, or does it not really matter? And I think that might sort of churn out, and it may be that transit service is the thing that is the determining factor, or
Yeah.
Well,
And
the
a lot of
area
it's the
that-
future visioning of the areas. Like maybe right now, an area looks like one thing and in the future you want it to look like another thing. That's all those open conversations. And that's the intention of zoning is you change what's allowed there over time. The area will, I mean, it could be a lot of time, but over time, the area will become more like what you've zoned it for.
Mhm.
Duncan, were you done with your?
No, I was just, I was looking at the two districts and thinking there's advantages to having housing in both of them a little bit and disadvantages.
Right.
But I think it's incredibly important to still maintain open space for industrial.
Yep.
specifically for industrial as
Yes,
opposed
yes,
to.
For new
Without,
stuff,
without
yeah.
housing.
Well, and
Without housing.
and part of the conversation that I was asking about is, should it also be considering industrial without, say,
Office.
office?
Yeah,
So that's another split
Right.
where
yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's
Yeah.
a lot of.
even within a
offices.
commercial area,
Mm.
if you had, say, 200 acres available of industrial space and all of that was taken up by offices and none of it was able for industrial, is that an okay outcome? Setting
Oh,
aside the
yeah.
housing question entirely. So we think that's an important question to look at, but this is
Mhm.
part of, scoping this project out is it's going to be hard conversations there.
Actually, if you want to see an example of the area that you just mentioned, Paul,
You're next.
behind the airport there, that's got some dirty, heavy industry like transfer stations and so on, and then some light industry, you know, kitchen cabinets and stuff like that,
And housing.
and some housing. No, I don't know if there's any housing down there.
There's a little bit.
There
Just
is
the
a little bit.
But maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And there's another.
So that's
Maybe there
Marla.
shouldn't be.
officially.
I'd have to look.
There
Colin,
is.
did you?
Or, yeah, I mean, I think, I think Duncan actually answered, asked all my questions already. But yeah, I'm definitely, I think I was to drill home with the whole, I like the idea of, I'm definitely very open to the idea of reserving space for industrial. Not always just, as I think you allude to, some of these existing industrial use campuses are very, very large, which is kind of necessary for industrial. And if that ever gets like subdivided at all by a different use case, we're never getting that back.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I think it is, I guess I also point, so considering we already have industrial uses, we're not like losing that much by forcing them to stay industrial, I guess is what as I see it. But yeah, I guess so. I agree with that. And I guess the one other thing is, in terms of how we're having this conversation, does it sort of almost make sense to kind of start by defining what the different kind of types of districts we want are, and then thinking about what boundary changes might be needed to make those make sense? Because I'm sort of seeing orders talk about these existing districts that have very big shifts, as we mentioned, in what they are, and that so we've existing districts that have very big shifts in character. Would it make sense to kind of, yeah, like come up with a list of like, this is like a light industrial area, or sorry, we want light industrial, we want heavy industrial, and we want a commercial district, and kind of come with the definitions first, and then kind of think, what do we need to change in the boundaries to make this make sense? Does that seem reasonable to people or unnecessary?
Well, no, I
think
mean,
about
it
it.
seems like and I mean, we could do it a little bit in
Boundary.
parallel, but
Mm.
you know, making sure that we have our categories of things we want, and then making sure that we have the area to do them in.
Mhm.
So you're right, we're not stuck with some line on the map necessarily, but if we identify that this industrial only, even without offices, is really important, we can say that, and then as a second step, really making sure we have the space for it. I mean,
And I don't think you're starting at zero on that either.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
the city plan does talk about character of both geographies, but also the character within them of what you're generally looking for. It's sort of like level 2 divisions, having made level 1 choices already. So
One quick clarification, this future land use map, what does this have like what does this, is this just like the city plan visualized, or is this legally binding at all? Or I guess I'm trying to understand a little what this thing we're seeing is.
Be fuzzy.
but it's legally binding. What do you want to answer?
Legally fuzzy.
Kelsey wants
If
to
this is the
say-
hornet's nest, we don't need to open this.
Do my job
big
and Duncan's
discussion
heckling.
Legally fuzzy. It's
Yeah,
exactly
no,
what it is.
Colin, you should know there was a big
You're doing
discussion
your
whether
job
it should be
really
fuzzy
well.
or not.
Okay.
So
The perfect Kelsey question.
this is the future land use map that was adopted as part of the city plan. You are correct, that is a visual representation of what the city is anticipating and planning for into the future. What it means is that, for example, if something on here is bright orange, you probably couldn't push through a zoning change into something that would make it orange is a bad example because it's kind of middle of the road. If something is bright red, you couldn't say, no, guess what? Actually, we're going to rezone all of Shelburne Road to be commercial only. You know, you can't do things that are directly in conflict with this map. But there are, when you do zoning changes and changes to your regulations, but you can do a lot of things with nuance in this map,
Okay.
as long as it is generally compliant with the purpose and vision of the map. That's why a lot of it, annoyingly, the captions of the colors are quite long, but it's intentional to say principally a certain thing, principally, like it says principally a lot, or balanced or commercial industrial with supporting uses to leave some of that space for flexibility as we do zoning changes under this plan.
So it's kind of like a vibe check on any
Yeah.
proposed legislation.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and legally, you were talking about the planning commission report earlier. The planning commission has to make a finding that any change is consistent and advances the city plan, aid stand, and state planning goals.
Mhm.
So that's your actual official action that you know, if you decided to say, oh, that, you know, the red area you think should be all single unit buildings at a 1 acre per unit, 1 acre per home density, that would be a very difficult finding to make there.
Gotcha.
Okay.
We go to those questions then.
I mean, we've talked through a lot of the questions.
The ones that were up
Yeah,
ago.
some of which I think may need to just be part of our discussion moving forward, like especially about the housing and like maybe where housing makes sense in some of these categories we were talking about and where maybe not, or what scale. I mean, so I think that's just part of the project.
Yeah. I mean, despite my advocating for housing in industrial areas, it's a bit of sprawl.
Right.
And so I'm conflicted about it. But to answer those questions, I had put yes, reservation of space for industrial only uses is important. But allowing housing is also important. My own notes say workforce housing should be multifamily, duplex and up, reserve space for housing, maximum densities. Is that a question that we should look at because of not overbuilding?
Mhm.
And if we do allow housing, it has to have enough usable outdoor space, the residents. Those are all things that we have to think about.
I think for me, when I'm excited about looking at this and then looking at what's around these areas. You know, I think many people are who are looking for housing nearby their work might be okay walking a quarter mile or something. So, you know, if we kind of look at where these areas are and then we look at maybe that walk shed, like, are we already designating enough housing areas within that walk shed to kind of support the industrial and commercial uses or not? And I think maybe that's the question of, is there housing close enough by that maybe it doesn't need to be like in the industrial area? Kind of looking a little broader. So maybe that could be part of it.
Yeah, and part of that could also be there are areas nearby that have until very recently been fairly limited in the amount of housing they were zoned for. And with the draft LDRs and with state law changes, you know, suddenly the capacity of some of these areas has quadrupled. So maybe it's not even what's currently there, but what, you know, what could be there just under state law and under what's under consideration by city council as part of that conversation.
Go ahead, Colin.
Well, one quick question just that I feel somewhere relevant to all these industrial things is I've noticed a lot of these districts we're talking about now are directly bordering Williston, and there's honestly I couldn't even tell you half the time when I'm in South Border, Williston, that area. I'm sure I'll get better with time, but does it make sense to, like, in terms of how we're considering what is directly over the municipal boundary, does that mean looking at, say, what their codes currently say, would it make sense to touch base with Williston, or just kind of like, we kind of just looking at what they have at the moment? Yeah, that would be my question. Like, I know, because I know it's definitely extra work, but it's just because they're so, I feel like they're kind of interconnected a lot in that particular area.
Yeah, so I actually don't think it's that much extra work. We know the people, our counterparts in Williston.
Mhm.
And we work directly with the Regional Planning Commission fairly regularly, almost daily. So Chittenden County is actually reasonably good in certain ways about thinking of the whole place as an ecosystem. Like people don't really care if they live in one town and work in the next. It's not, I have to live and work in the same place or anything similar. The interesting thing about the boundary with Williston is there's really only three major crossings, in four. What's the fourth? Industrial, Williston, Kimball.
Oh, near the airport, north of the airport.
Oh, way up
there's
by
a-
the airport. Yeah. Isn't it a dirt road?
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
a
It's
dirt
our only
road,
pit
but
road.
then it's not a
It's
dirt
our
road.
only dirt road?
River Cove.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway,
A lot of maintenance for that one,
it is.
a dirt road.
Um, but yes, it's something that would actually be a fairly simple ask because it's not like a grid of every 200 feet, there's another road kind of a system. There's certain points where people who live in Williston enter South Burlington and vice versa. I will say the zoning is fairly similar. On the other side of the line, Williston ends up allowing housing north of Williston Road more quickly than we do. But the whole area, Kimball Avenue, like where the Curtis Lumber and the Best Tile and all those things are, flows pretty well from the South Burlington side. But absolutely, we can work with Williston about this kind of analysis.
Cool. Yeah, 'cause I feel so, especially for something with industrial, there's definitely, I think, a lot to be gained for having a kind of industrial kind of super district in a sense.
Yeah.
Just because those uses are you want to isolate them in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and especially because there's definitely uses in this area that use the Williston exit to go south on the highway instead of coming through South Burlington. So some of the like trucking impacts or, noise impacts or something actually is even more in Williston than it is in South Burlington.
I just wanted to say, I think it'll be very interesting to look at, housing and what type we want to allow and how we want to allow it. But also I think, this might reference Ryan's comment earlier about our fiduciary responsibility. Commercial is always going to be better than residential for the tax base.
Usually.
Generally, it's going to be better. So, I mean, that's just something to think about. And I'm thinking if we let housing in and we're too broad, then we lose that
Right.
commercial space.
Yeah, no, it has
Yeah.
to be managed.
Yeah.
I have a question, just a clarification for me. When we talk about industrial, are we really wanting to save space for heavy industrial? Or is that, I mean, I think of the two industrial or three industrial parks and, would a battery factory go in there? Or, if Tesla wanted to start making cars in South Burlington, I mean, that's heavy industrial, heavy industry. Is that allowed, or is that what we're thinking we want to keep the door open for that? Or are we really talking about more like,
Beta.
another FedEx or I don't know, or a
Beta.
So
or Beta?
right.
Yeah.
Currently, we don't have what would be considered classically heavy manufacturing as an allowed use in our
Okay,
our
so it's not
community-
an allowed
Right.
use. Okay.
But there are lots of manufacturing users that we would define as somewhere between R&D, research and development, and manufacturing. So whether it's
DR Power,
Yeah,
maybe.
Dynapower or Supertemp or OnLogic.
Beta?
Beta is an interesting one, and that's sort of in an airport category. FedEx is an interesting one because it's not really manufacturing, it's more warehousing and distribution.
Right, but a lot of heavy trucks.
Right, lots of heavy trucks. They're not,
Yeah.
but it's not heavy manufacturing in the chemical sense of it.
Right, that's
In
what I
a
was-
sort of like a, and I think that our research has shown that so far that the classic definition of heavy manufacturing is less and less prevalent, especially in areas that are at the extreme corners of the country.
Sure. Well, I wouldn't,
For example.
Well,
oh,
that.
no, we
and-
don't have the trains and the airport is only so big, but
Right, and it's, my understanding is true heavy manufacturing requires a lot of space. Like we couldn't actually fit
Yeah.
something like a Tesla factory in anywhere that remains in South Burlington.
Hundreds and hundreds of acres.
Hundreds and hundreds of acres, and the land cost in Vermont generally is way too high per acre.
Flat.
And the land is not flat. So it would be extremely difficult for modern heavy industry to locate in Vermont. That's why, you know, Toyota manufactures cars in Indiana. Like there's a lot of land, it's very flat and it's a lot less expensive than in New England.
Yeah,
You know, I think Helen, you really touched on like where like this project and project scope overlaps with agenda item 5 project scope of like kind of rehashing some of those use definitions. And I really loved how Colin, you used the word sensory experience. Because I think that that same type of like sensory experience like applies to what you're talking about. This like, you know, are we boiling and refining gas or are we, you know, are we making cupcakes? Like they're pretty
sure.
like, so what, yeah, I think what makes sense for our city, we're defining also, and then where it would go and.
yeah, I was looking for a definition. I didn't find one for heavy industry, but for light industry, there was a definition that it's producing goods in one location using light machinery.
Yeah. It has kind of a catch-all of this and this and this and this and this and this and this, but not fat rendering of fats and something else. Like it's a very long definition that is.
Get that far.
Oh, well, it's light, it's light manufacturing and it's both too long to be usable and too short to cover everything that actually needs to be included in it. So it's not a very workable,
This is in
Definition.
our current LDR?
yeah.
No,
It's about 6 lines long in the page and it both includes too much and too little at the same time.
So we could have like a dynamite factory, but we can't render fats, just that like.
Maybe.
Do we, well, so I guess
next to each
where do we need to go from here? Do we have enough for kind of the scope of work and to kind of move to the next step at this
You
point?
didn't answer the last question was about should supporting
Oh.
uses be allowed?
Yeah, and so supporting uses, we've talked a lot about housing versus commercial, but there are a lot of other things that are supporting uses that advance some of the city's goals towards like reducing vehicle miles traveled and other things. So for example, could you have a deli in Tech Park so that people could walk to instead of having to drive to somewhere to get their lunch for the day? Currently, there's a few, at least one, I don't know if there's more than one, uses that are in that sort of realm, but are accessory. So the Kestrel Coffee Roasters that's inside the building that has Ben and Jerry's and it might still have NBC5 in there. Yeah.
And have a gym?
Right. So a big building that has a few large
Well, next
employers
to
in it
that-
have a small coffee
Food,
shop.
actually.
Still there? How do we want to examine those kinds of uses that are supporting, aren't necessarily commercial or housing, but are those supporting uses in between that help meet some of our goals for walkability and bikeability and for other, you know, for just sort of work life.
Support the needs of people who
Right.
work.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think, and finding the balance between supporting and being their own
Attraction.
attraction and driver of sort of not the employment there. So if you had a little, I'll use my convenience store example. If you had a little convenience store in the middle of Tech Park, it might serve all the employees. If you had Costco in the middle of Tech Park, it's, you know, it's its own gravitational pull, which pulls away from other city goals. Example, or
If scale is one of the determinants, then that would be out.
I think this might depend on what the thing is. Like, you know, I think going back to that discussion of can OnLogic have some internal apartments for visitors so they don't have to pay hotel bills for their visiting employees. Like that feels like maybe that would even fall into an accessory use versus a coffee shop or like a deli could be its own little building as a principal. I mean, so maybe we need to really think about like how they relate to each kind of zone we're talking about. It might be different between the different ones, so.
Right,
We've
so
had a lot of
yeah.
discussion up here. I want to make sure we're hearing from Paul and our audience members before we wrap up. Tim? Do you wanna-
Thank you, Tim Barrett, resident. I want to echo what Michael said about the trip you took around Tech Park and Meadowland. That eastern section of Tech Park, right, where there are the two office buildings. One is, I think it's now the East Rise Federal Credit Union, and the other one is the, I think it's Customs and Immigration Services. That field on that eastern portion of land is an incredible view shed for Mount Mansfield. And there is a lot of land there. And if you put a couple of really nice apartment buildings there, I don't know what price point they would be, with views of Mount Mansfield. You have a lot of open space around there. You have access to the Lubbock Bridge. You can go over to Tilly Drive. You can, there's a lot of interconnection there. That is a really prime space for housing, in my opinion. Now, you may have a different opinion, but that is a good spot, and for really dense, a couple of buildings there. And then it would complement if you did have some of these smaller restaurant type businesses that wanted to be open past the end of the business day, because that's who they serve now. And Meadowland, right, has a view shed as well, which is pretty amazing, especially as you back up towards Heinsberg Road. The only caveat there is that all that light manufacturing, status is really, I think it's benign, except for the crematorium. So I don't know how much people would like to live, but there are already people living pretty close to it on a neighboring residential area. So anyway, I just wanted to say that there's some prime property with views, and there's a lot of opportunity and potential there to mix those two uses together and get a benefit of more housing, which, as you know, is pretty important. Thanks.
Yeah. And Tim, which is the spot you started out by talking about first?
On Kimball.
You said,
Along
Yeah, if you're
Kimball.
on Kimball looking towards the U of Tech Park, you've got two office buildings.
yeah,
They're both built by Pizzagalli, I think. The one on the left is for the credit union, the right one is the
Yep.
government. The right one is a leased building. But all that land going in back of those two buildings, right?
mhm.
Between what used to be digital.
Yeah, okay, got it.
Property
I
between
just wanted to
those
make
two and
sure
the
it
old
was,
digital
Up
plant.
until you have like Ben and Jerry's and
Mhm.
those
Yeah.
facilities up there. Yeah,
thank you.
thanks.
Paul Engels?
Sure. I've just mostly been listening, but I've had a couple of questions or thoughts. When Helen began talking
Oh,
about,
can you hear him?
can you hear me okay?
Can
No.
you speak up a little bit louder?
We're gonna turn you
I
up
think it's more on
too.
our end.
Okay,
Um,
Paul turned you up.
Great.
Okay,
That's better.
the discussion about transparency and the word accessibility came up. And I think for the most part, both of them are overused and have become really buzzwords. But I did a little research here to find, Paul mentioned plain language, and I did a little research to see what the buzzwords were for plain language. And of course, there aren't any, because plain language is plain language.
Language.
So, and there's apparently a whole movement afoot, to, convert the world to plain language. So there's good information about it, and it's perfectly okay term to use. So you might think about that. And the other question I had, Paul, we were talking, I don't know what we were talking about, but you mentioned that in form-based code, there are things that are prohibited, and then everything else was okay, that function follows form. So what were those, I mean, if you can think of offhand what those prohibitions are, I'd be curious to know that.
Sure, Paul. So there's two categories in the form-based code. So there's uses that are prohibited, period, within the different transects, and those are typically things like there's like one that's like really heavy truck traffic one, and I think that there's maybe like adult uses and a handful of others. It's not a very long list, but it is it's sort of very intensive uses of land or that kind of thing. There's a second category of prohibited in a non-conforming building. So, you know, as you described, form follows function. Lots of city center already exists in a not form-based code way. And so something like auto sales is theoretically allowed if the building is fully conforming, because then you'd be in an urban setup and the car would be in the show inside the showroom. But a car dealership would not be allowed you know, just in the middle of San Remo Drive today, because that's a non-conforming building setup. So that's the big distinction. And that might be a bad example of a car dealership, but things along those lines where
Yeah.
it's allowed once the form actually is met, as a reflection that what we are aspiring to is not necessarily what exists today.
Okay, Paul, thanks.
Paul, did you have anything else, Paul?
Well, I mean, I could put my 2 cents in for form-based code and say
I just
that,
wanted to make sure I wasn't cutting you off.
no, I mean, this discussion about the various functions is something that we, you know, we could escape by having form-based code. I mean,
One-
kind of reach that point, kind of reach that level where we're discussing the various functions that are allowable or not allowable. And that's exactly what form-based code addresses, as far as I understand it. That pretty much everything's permissible, other than, as Paul outlined, some in different transects are prohibited, but for the most part, everything's permitted, as long as the buildings look like what I would think of they're supposed to look like. I guess that wasn't quite as clear as I'd hoped it would be.
No, Paul, I think that's really good. And I guess I'm glad I asked, because I thought that that was your view, and I wanted to make sure that that was really clear.
Yeah, because I mean, and having a discussion like this, we're definitely skirting with those kinds of issues.
Colin, you had a question?
I guess one thing is also to think about, especially if we're talking about these, you know, commercial and industrial use out in the more eastern extremities of the city. I remember hearing, I think is that there's been very long-term talk of the idea of, you know, changing how like V-Trans, changing how South Burlington is connected to the interstate. My recollection is two considerations were potentially either changing 189 to be a full interchange, or perhaps adding an exit at 116. Does that at all, that potential what might be happening? So I guess I sort of ask, like, for example, if V-Trans decides to add a exit at 116, that is going to pretty quickly shift how desirable that land is, particularly for like industrial uses and commercial uses. Does that come into our conversation at all? Or is this more kind of like, my understanding is this might be happening 10, 20 years in the future, like very far down the line. Is this just broadening our scope way too much?
Let me answer the second part of the question first. So there was a study recently completed called Envision 89 that was looking at the corridor as a whole. It had within it a series of recommendations, and the recommendations start with examining and doing improvements to Exit 14 to have it function better. And then it has a series of recommendations about how the existing network can be improved throughout the core of Chittenden County, not the interstate, but all the rest of the connections. And there's evaluation within that in support of our transportation goals in the community. If and when at the conclusion of that effort, it is deemed that there is a need to add additional capacity to the interstate by exits, then the analysis of that would begin. So you
Okay.
described a 10 to 20-year phase. I think it is much more likely, even if we started today realistically saying that is a goal, 20 years is the endpoint of that.
Mhm.
So I'd say the start point is more like 15 or more
Gotcha.
years in the future, with it 20 years after that completion. If we look at any major project like this in the last 50 years in Vermont, it's 10 years is the small projects.
Gotcha.
So I would be saying it's looking at a
Like my
generational
projects.
question, not a, we should be planning for it in the life cycle of,
Okay.
15 years.
Not yours.
Um,
But
You'll be alive, but probably the rest of us won't.
Colin, there was also, one of the options was to fix 13 so that it's a proper.
Yeah, no, that's, yeah, I
So
remember.
direct access to the
Yeah.
airport and all the rest of it.
And-
you're next, Ryan.
And the only thing I would just add to that super quickly is part of the analysis, the specific to this Heinsberg Road area, a lot of the transportation improvements that would be needed, and this is something that we did our own study of, to mitigate the implications of an interchange are also the same improvements that you would need to forestall the need for the interchange. So both ways, doing the other improvements first is the best path, because it is both forestalls and mitigates the need for,
Hmm.
if that makes any sense.
I hear
Yeah.
that, yeah.
So, okay.
You got your mic on?
Yeah. Ryan here. So going over just, the whole last two things we talked about, not all things that are considered bad smelling are pollution. I think a good example would be perfumes. I don't know if I know, like when I sang in choir, like before Christmas, we'd always get that last minute memo of like, do not use any perfume before you show up to church. Like it will bother people. And so while that is not bad for folks, it could be noxious in the sense that it's very irritating in a neighborhood area if somebody's doing a small scale production or something. I think trucks are really important, and it's not just the size of the trucks coming through, but also the frequency. How much waste is produced, how often do garbage trucks need to come and service the dumpsters of this type of a business? How often will FedEx and UPS be driving through this area to drop things off? Can they be serviced by a small truck, or would this commercial or industrial enterprise need large trucks besides just when they're setting up, but on an ongoing basis? And something that I really would like to provide a perspective on for you all to think about long term is what vehicles belong where, and how we design our roads makes a really big impact on if people actually use them for walking and biking. So if we have places where we are mixing large trucks with large turning radiuses and large crosswalks and faster driving speeds, it is inappropriate for housing. So while it might be very beautiful on the east side of the industrial park, you have FedEx, probably the largest generator of semi-truck traffic in the city, just a guess, trying to put people to live there and live a good life that's not auto dependent is kind of a pipe dream. And so without being really specific about the paths that we want large trucks to take and concentrating the types of industries that use large trucks, both the really heavy, like industrial types of uses that really do pull a lot of tax weight value, as well as the kind of box commercial, which does not pull a very good tax value. If you look at any box store in the city, I'm assessed at a much higher value per acre than they are. That's part of the reason why the state lets us levy that 1 cent tax on all of the sales of commercial goods for the town, because they take up a lot of land, they generate a lot of traffic, they do not produce a lot of actual tax value for the municipality. I have a graphic I can send to you that's more detailed about that, Duncan. And so being really specific about what roads are okay to have large trucks on, I think is a weird but important starting point for conversations about where we can start blurring the lines with things like where people can live and where we want to make our epicenter of like the large, loud, heavy stuff that will pull a lot of tax weight and help us fund, you know, future school renovations, for example, in the way that housing just won't do and the way large commercial just won't do. I'll try to drum up some more information about that to be more specific, but in terms of walking, you look at the west side of that industrial park, it's closer to residential already. It's more likely to be queued into walking and biking infrastructure sooner, and it might be able to be built in a way, even if it's like on facility housing for an commercial enterprise or industrial enterprise, be set up in a way that FedEx traffic would only be routed out a certain way from that road, or other future industrial uses could only go in one direction. That actually really parlays well with Colin's comment about exit 12B. Yeah, I followed the I-89 study. I really hate the idea of an exit 12B on Heinsberg Road. I'm really in favor of an exit 12B on a road that does not exist between our industrial park and Heinsberg Road, south of Butler Farm. We have an industrial area just to the east there. It's routing a state route to the heart of heavy truck traffic, both for South Burlington and for Williston. Would be able to take a lot of that really bad traffic away from so many other streets in both municipalities, really limit that in a way that allows us to have more flexibility in terms of making places safe to walk and bike. That's a very long kind of thought to have. But I do want to put that out there for people to consider as we try to marry these things together.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ryan. And I apologize. We didn't open it up for comment between the two items. So thank you for compiling all that. Anything else on this item for tonight? No, great.
No, I think we're in good shape, and the next time you see it, you'll see those project scope graphs, and we can move forward on further work.
Great. So we have 4 sets of minutes. We have June 25, August 27, September 10, September 24.
Move to approve. the
Second.
minutes of June 25th, August 27th, September 10th, and September 24th.
I'll second that.
I think Duncan might have already seconded.
A second before Michael was even finished.
Okay, well, maybe you need to finish the statement before you can second. Okay, and this is a thing where, do we need to do if we're unanimous, we don't need to do roll call. Okay, all in favor of the minutes? Aye. Okay, unanimous. Paul said it out loud, and so we are adjourned.
Awesome.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. We
you.
are 1 minute early. Thank you so much, Paul.
Cool.
Never happens except when Duncan shares.